They saw me. I walked out calmly when my husband held my hand and said, "Leave calmly," in the middle of the party. The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor of the ballroom. Every eye in the room turned toward me, but it was not the broken crystal that made my blood run cold. It was the realization that after 15 years of carefully constructed lies, my past had finally caught up with me. My husband Marcus reached for my hand, his fingers warm against my suddenly ice-cold skin. His voice was steady, controlled, the same tone he used during board meetings when million-dollar deals hung in the balance. "Leave calmly," he whispered, his lips barely moving as he smiled at the crowd of Seattle's elite surrounding us. But leaving calmly was the last thing I wanted to do. My legs felt like concrete pillars rooted to the floor of the Grand Hyatt's Crystal Ballroom. The annual charity gala for the Children's Hospital was supposed to be our night of triumph. Marcus had just been announced as the new chairman of the board, and I was meant to be the perfect wife by his side, radiant in my navy blue Oscar de la Renta gown. Instead, I was standing frozen in a room full of 200 of the most influential people in Washington state, knowing that everything we had built together was about to crumble. The woman who had been staring at me from across the room was now walking in our direction. Detective Sarah Chen looked exactly as she had 15 years ago, except for the silver streaks in her black hair and the confident stride of someone who had spent decades hunting down people like me. She wore a simple black cocktail dress that probably cost a tenth of what mine did, but she carried herself with an authority that made every designer gown in the room seem trivial. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice cutting through the classical music and polite chatter like a blade. "It has been a very long time." Marcus squeezed my hand tighter. I could feel his wedding ring pressing against my finger, a reminder of the life I had built on a foundation of carefully buried secrets. Around us, conversations continued, but I noticed how several heads turned in our direction. In Seattle's social circles, people had a sixth sense for drama, and they could smell it in the air like expensive perfume. "I am sorry. I think you have me confused with someone else," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The lie came easily after years of practice, but I could see in Detective Chen's dark eyes that she was not buying it for a second. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Rebecca Thompson, also known as Becca, age 22 at the time of the incident. You were working as a night shift nurse at Providence Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, on March 15th, 2009. The words hit me like physical blows. March 15th, the night that changed everything. The night I thought I had buried so deep that it would never surface again. Marcus's grip on my hand was now so tight it was almost painful, but I welcomed the sensation. It was the only thing keeping me grounded as the ballroom seemed to tilt around me. The crystal chandeliers above cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, I was transported back to that sterile hospital corridor 15 years ago, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. "I really do not know what you are talking about," I said, but even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. Detective Chen reached into her small black purse and pulled out a photograph. It was old, slightly faded, but the image was crystal clear. A young woman with long blonde hair and tired eyes wearing scrubs, her hospital identification badge clearly visible. Rebecca Thompson, RN, my maiden name, my real name. The name I had not used since I walked out of Portland 15 years ago and reinvented myself as Elena Whitmore. The photograph was taken from a security camera, I realized, probably from the hospital's main entrance. I remembered that camera, how I had always made sure to walk with my head down whenever I passed beneath it. But on that final night, I had been careless, desperate, and apparently, that single moment of carelessness was enough to undo everything. "The statute of limitations has not run out, Rebecca," Detective Chen said quietly, using my real name like a weapon. Not for what happened that night. Around us, the gala continued. A string quartet played Vivaldi near the windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays of canapés and champagne. Seattle's most prominent citizens laughed and networked, completely unaware that my entire world was disintegrating just a few feet away from them. Marcus had not said a word since Detective Chen approached us, but I could feel the tension radiating from his body. He was a man who prided himself on control, on always having a plan, on never being caught off guard. But there was no contingency plan for this moment. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Justice," Detective Chen replied simply. The families deserve closure. They have been waiting 15 years for answers. The families. My chest tightened as I thought about them. The faces I had tried so hard to forget. Mrs. Rodriguez, clutching her rosary in the hospital waiting room. Mr. Patterson, pacing the halls at 3 a.m, his coffee long gone cold. The Williams family, holding vigil by their daughter's bedside. They all trusted me. They all believed I was there to help their loved ones recover. They had no idea what I was really doing in those quiet, desperate hours when the hospital corridors were empty, except for the occasional security guard making his rounds. "This is not the place for this conversation," Marcus said, finally finding his voice. His tone was diplomatic, the voice of a man accustomed to negotiating his way out of difficult situations. "Perhaps we could arrange a meeting at a more appropriate time and location." Detective Chen's smile grew wider, but it was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore, I think this is the perfect place. After all, your wife has been hiding in plain sight for 15 years, playing the role of the devoted philanthropist's wife. It seems fitting that the truth should come out at a charity event. Dawn, not you think?" The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, surrounded by people who spent their evenings writing checks to children's hospitals, while I carried the weight of what I had done to children in my care all those years ago. "I need some air," I said, my voice cracking despite my efforts to maintain composure. "Of course," Detective Chen said, "but I hope you understand that leaving this building would be inadvisable." Marcus guided me toward the terrace doors, his hand firm on the small of my back. Several people nodded and smiled as we passed, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding before their eyes. Mrs. Hartwell, who served on the hospital board with Marcus, even complimented my dress. "Stunning as always, Elena," she said warmly. "You and Marcus make such a beautiful couple." The words felt like daggers. Beautiful couple. If only she knew what kind of woman was standing beside her beloved board chairman. The terrace overlooked Puget Sound, and the cool April evening air was a relief after the stifling atmosphere inside. Seattle's skyline glittered in the darkness, the Space Needle illuminated against the night sky. It was a view I had grown to love over the past 12 years, but tonight it felt like I was seeing it for the last time. Marcus closed the glass doors behind us, muffling the sounds of the party. We were alone, except for the distant hum of traffic from the streets below. 15 years, he said quietly, staring out at the water. 15 years, Elena. How could you not tell me? It was the first time he had called me Elena since Detective Chen had used my real name. The hurt in his voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than any accusation could have. "Because I thought it was over," I whispered. "I thought I had left Rebecca Thompson behind forever." "What did you do?" His question was simple, but I could hear the fear underneath it. Fear of the answer. Fear of what it would mean for us. For our life together. For everything we had built. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. The terrace was empty except for us, but I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the entire city could see through the carefully constructed facade I had maintained for so long. "I was young," I began, then stopped. That was not an excuse. What I had done could not be explained away by youth or inexperience. "Elena," his voice was firm now, demanding, "what did you do?" Before I could answer, the terrace doors opened behind us. Detective Chen stepped outside, followed by a man I did not recognize. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many sleepless nights in difficult cases. "Detective Morrison," Chen said by way of introduction. He worked the original case with me. Morrison studied my face with the intensity of someone comparing me to a photograph. After a moment, he nodded. "It is her," he said with certainty. 15 years older, different hair color, but it is definitely Rebecca Thompson. The name hung in the air between us. Rebecca Thompson, the person I used to be, the person I thought I had killed and buried when I drove out of Portland, with nothing but a suitcase and a new identity. "Mrs. Whitmore," Detective Chen said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for the murders of Maria Santos, age 8, David Patterson, age 12, and Jennifer Williams, age 6. The words hit me like a physical blow. Murders. She had said murders. "Wait," Marcus said, stepping between us. "This is insane. My wife is not a murderer. There has been some kind of mistake." But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. 15 years of marriage, and he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time. "There is no mistake, Mr. Whitmore," Detective Morrison said. "Your wife worked the night shift in the pediatric intensive care unit. Over a period of 6 months, 7 children died under suspicious circumstances. All of them had been showing signs of improvement before their sudden decline. 7 children. The number felt impossible, too large, too terrible to be real. But as he spoke, their faces flashed through my memory. Not just Maria, David, and Jennifer, but all of them. Tommy Chen, no relation to the detective despite sharing a surname, Ashley Brooks, Michael Rivera, and little Emma Foster, who had been only 4 years old. The hospital conducted an internal investigation, Detective Chen continued, but by the time they realized what was happening, Rebecca Thompson had disappeared. No forwarding address, no contact information. She had simply vanished. Until tonight, Morrison added. Until someone recognized your photograph in a newspaper article about your husband's appointment to the hospital board and called our tip line. My legs gave out. I sank onto one of the wrought iron chairs scattered around the terrace, the cold metal shocking against my skin through the thin fabric of my dress. Everything was unraveling so quickly that I could barely process what was happening. Marcus stood frozen, staring at me as if he had never seen me before, and perhaps he had not. The woman he married was Elena Whitmore, devoted wife and philanthropist. Rebecca Thompson was a stranger to him. "I need to call my lawyer," he said finally, his voice mechanical. "Of course," Detective Chen replied, "but your wife will be coming with us tonight." "No." The word came out stronger than I intended. I stood up, surprising myself with my own steadiness. "I will not run anymore. For 15 years, I had been running. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally, psychologically. Every day had been an act, a performance designed to convince the world that I was someone I was not. The weight of that deception had been crushing, even when I had not allowed myself to acknowledge it. "Elena, do not say anything else," Marcus warned, but I ignored him. "My name is Rebecca Thompson," I said, looking directly at Detective Chen, "and I killed those children." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus took a step back from me, his face pale in the glow of the city lights. Detective Morrison was writing in a small notebook, his pen scratching against the paper with mechanical precision. But Detective Chen just nodded, as if she had been waiting 15 years to hear those exact words. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the question I had been asking myself for 15 years, the question that had haunted my dreams and poisoned my waking hours, the question I had never been able to answer, not even to myself. "I do not know," I whispered, and for the first time in years, I was telling the complete truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the sounds of the city below seemed muted, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Detective Chen studied my face with the intensity of someone who had spent years waiting for this moment, searching for any sign of deception in my features. "You do not know," she repeated slowly. "You killed 7 children, and you do not know why." "I remember the nights," I said, my voice growing stronger despite the trembling in my hands. "I remember walking into their rooms. I remember their faces. But the why has been eating at me for 15 years. Marcus turned away from me completely, his hands gripping the terrace railing so tightly his knuckles were white. The man who had stood beside me through 12 years of marriage, who had held my hand through his mother's funeral, and celebrated every professional triumph with champagne and quiet pride, was now looking at me as if I were a complete stranger. "She needs psychiatric evaluation," he said to the detectives, his voice hollow. This cannot be the woman I married." But it was. It absolutely was. And that truth was perhaps the most devastating of all. Detective Morrison closed his notebook and stepped closer. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." "I understand," I said, though nothing about this situation felt understandable. "But I am tired of running. I am tired of pretending to be someone else." The terrace doors opened again, and I could see several people from the party peering out curiously. Word was spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Seattle's social circles would know that Marcus Whitmore's wife had been arrested at the charity gala. The scandal would destroy him professionally, socially, personally. "We need to move this inside," Detective Chen said, noticing the growing audience. "Is there a private room we can use?" Marcus nodded toward the hotel manager, who had appeared at the doorway. "Conference room B," he said quietly. "It will be private." As we walked back through the ballroom, I felt hundreds of eyes tracking our movement. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet continued playing, but the music seemed discordant now, out of place in the midst of such drama. Mrs. Hartwell approached us near the auction tables, her brow furrowed with concern. "Marcus, dear, is everything all right?" "Elena looks terribly pale." "Family emergency," Marcus replied smoothly, but I could hear the strain in his voice. "We need to leave immediately." It was not technically a lie, I supposed. What was happening certainly felt like an emergency, and it would definitely tear our family apart. The conference room was sterile and impersonal, with beige walls and a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. Detective Morrison closed the door behind us while Detective Chen activated a small recording device. "This is Detective Sarah Chen, badge number 4789, conducting an interview with Rebecca Thompson, also known as Elena Whitmore, on April 22, 2024, at approximately 10:45 in the evening." The formality of it made everything feel surreal. This was really happening. After 15 years of carefully constructed normalcy, my past had finally caught up with me in the most public way possible. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Chen continued, "you have stated that you killed 7 children while working as a pediatric nurse in Portland, Oregon, between September 2008 and March 2009. Is this correct?" "Yes," I said, the word barely audible. "Can you tell us about the first incident?" I closed my eyes, and immediately I was back in that hospital room, the smell of disinfectant and floor wax, the steady beeping of monitors, the soft wheeze of a ventilator helping tiny lungs breathe. "Tommy Chen," I said, 5 years old. He had been admitted for pneumonia, but he was getting better. His fever had broken, and he was starting to eat solid food again. What happened? I went into his room during my rounds. It was around 3 in the morning. The corridor was empty except for the security guard at the far end, and he was reading a magazine. The details came back with startling clarity, as if it had happened yesterday instead of 15 years ago. Tommy was sleeping peacefully. His breathing was steady, normal. And then, I opened my eyes and looked directly at Detective Chen. I injected air into his IV line. He went into cardiac arrest within minutes. The crash team tried to resuscitate him, but he died. Detective Morrison finished. "Yes, he died." Marcus made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. He had moved to the far corner of the room, as if physical distance could somehow separate him from what I was confessing. "Why Tommy?" Detective Chen asked. "What made you choose him?" It was the question I had been dreading, because the answer made me sound like a monster. He reminded me of my brother. "Your brother?" "Jamie. He died when he was 5. Cancer. I spent months watching him waste away in a hospital bed, watching machines keep him alive long after he should have been allowed to die peacefully." My voice cracked, and I had to pause to collect myself. Tommy had the same dark hair, the same big brown eyes. When I saw him lying there, hooked up to all those machines, I thought I was being merciful. "Merciful," Detective Chen repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "I know how that sounds. I know it was wrong. But at the time, in my mind, I was ending their suffering before it could really begin. I was saving them from what my brother went through." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the party continuing in the ballroom. The charity gala would go on without us, I realized. The auction would proceed, the donations would be collected, and by tomorrow morning, it would be remembered not for the money raised for sick children, but for the moment when a pediatric nurse confessed to murdering the very children she had sworn to protect. "What about the other children?" Detective Morrison asked. "Did they all remind you of your brother?" "No," I admitted. After Tommy, it became easier. The second time was Ashley Brooks. She was 7, recovering from appendix surgery. She was crying for her mother, and I could not bear the sound. "So you killed her to stop her crying?" Put so bluntly, it sounded even more horrific than it had in my memory. I told myself I was preventing her from experiencing more pain. But really, I think I was just stopping my own pain. Her crying reminded me of Jamie's last days. Marcus had sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs, his head in his hands. I wanted to go to him, to try to explain, to make him understand that the woman he married was not the same person who had committed those acts. But I knew that any comfort I might offer would be rejected, and rightfully so. "Tell us about Maria Santos," Detective Chen said, consulting her notes. Maria, 8 years old, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. She had been admitted for observation after a playground accident. Nothing serious. She should have gone home the next day. She was the third, I said. By then, I was not thinking clearly. I was not sleeping well, barely eating. The guilt was consuming me, but I could not stop. It was like an addiction to killing children, an addiction to the feeling of control. In those moments, I felt like I was God. I could decide who lived and who died. After watching my brother suffer for months with no power to help him, it was intoxicating to finally have that kind of control. The confession poured out of me like poison being drained from a wound. For 15 years, I had carried this weight alone, and now that I was finally sharing it, I felt simultaneously lighter and more disgusted with myself than ever before. The hospital staff never suspected anything? Detective Morrison asked. Not at first. Pediatric wards see more deaths than people realize. Children are fragile, and sometimes they just fade. It was not until the 6th death that anyone started asking questions. What changed? Dr. Patricia Williams. She was the attending physician for 3 of the children. She noticed that all of the unexpected deaths had occurred during my shifts, and she started paying closer attention to the patterns. Dr. Williams. I wondered if she was still practicing medicine, or if what happened had affected her the same way it had affected me. She had been a good doctor, thorough and compassionate. She had deserved better than to have a killer working under her supervision. Is that when you decided to run? Detective Chen asked. I knew it was only a matter of time before they figured it out. The hospital had started its own investigation, and I could see the suspicion in people's eyes when they looked at me. So on March 15th, after my last shift, I cleaned out my locker, got in my car, and drove north. Why Seattle? It was far enough away to feel safe, but not so far that I would seem to be running from something. I had enough money saved up to start over, and Washington State was not checking nursing licenses as carefully as they should have been back then. The irony was not lost on me that I had ended up married to a man who now sat on the board of a children's hospital, the same type of institution where I had committed my crimes. Perhaps it had been some twisted form of penance, devoting myself to helping sick children from the outside, while carrying the guilt of the ones I had killed. How did you become Elena Whitmore? Detective Morrison asked. I bought fake identification from someone I met in a bar in Tacoma. Birth certificate, social security card, nursing license. It cost me almost everything I had saved, but it was worth it to disappear completely. And then you met Marcus. 3 years later. I was working at Seattle Children's Hospital by then, and he was on the board. We met at a hospital fundraiser, actually. Another charity event just like tonight. Marcus finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with pain. You worked with children again, he said, his voice hoarse. After what you did, you went back to working with children. I never worked directly with patients again, I said quickly. I took a position in hospital administration. I thought if I could help sick children from a distance, it might somehow balance the scales. Balance the scales? Detective Chen's voice was sharp. 7 children are dead because of you. There is no balancing those scales. She was right, of course. There was no redemption for what I had done. No amount of good works that could bring back Tommy Chen or Ashley Brooks or any of the others. I had known that for 15 years, but I had tried anyway, hoping that somehow I could earn forgiveness that I did not deserve. The families, I said suddenly. Do they know? They will be contacted tomorrow, Detective Morrison said. They deserve to know what really happened to their children. Tomorrow. By tomorrow, 7 families would finally have answers to questions that had haunted them for 15 years, but those answers would bring no comfort, no peace. If anything, knowing the truth would probably make their grief worse. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had clutched her rosary and prayed for her grandson's soul, she would learn that her prayers had been answered too late, that Tommy had died not from illness, but from the deliberate actions of someone she had trusted. Mr. Patterson, who had blamed himself for not being at the hospital when David died. He would discover that his presence would not have mattered, that his son had been murdered while he slept peacefully at home. The weight of their pain, added to my own guilt, felt unbearable. I want to plead guilty, I said suddenly. I do not want a trial. I do not want those families to have to relive their trauma in a courtroom. Detective Chen and Detective Morrison exchanged glances. That is between you and the district attorney, Chen said. But I appreciate the sentiment. A knock at the door interrupted us. A uniformed police officer entered, carrying handcuffs and looking apologetic about the intrusion. "Transport is ready," he said quietly. This was it. The moment when Elena Whitmore would cease to exist, and Rebecca Thompson would face the consequences of her actions. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady after sitting for so long. Marcus stood up too, his movements mechanical and uncertain. For a moment, we faced each other across the conference room, 15 years of marriage hanging in the balance. "I loved you," he said finally. "The woman I thought you were. I loved her completely." "She loved you too," I replied, tears finally beginning to fall. "That part was real, Marcus. Whatever else was a lie, my love for you was always real." He nodded once, then turned away as Officer Baker placed the handcuffs around my wrists. The metal was cold and heavy, but somehow it felt appropriate. I had been carrying invisible chains for 15 years. Now the physical ones simply made the burden visible to everyone else. The Seattle Police Department holding cell smelled of disinfectant and despair. I sat on the narrow metal bench, still wearing my Oscar de la Renta gown, though it was now wrinkled and stained with tears. The blue fabric that had made me feel elegant just hours ago now felt like a costume from a play I could no longer remember the lines to. It was 3:30 in the morning, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the same mechanical persistence I remembered from the hospital corridors in Portland. Some sounds, I realized, followed you no matter how far you ran, or how completely you tried to reinvent yourself. A female officer named Rodriguez had taken my jewelry, my purse, even the bobby pins from my hair. She had been professional, but not unkind, perhaps sensing that I was not the typical criminal who passed through these doors. Or maybe she had read the preliminary reports and knew exactly what kind of criminal I was. The worst kind. The kind who preyed on the most vulnerable. My cellmate was a woman in her 20s who had been arrested for drunk driving. She had spent the first hour crying and vomiting into the metal toilet in the corner, but now she was passed out on the other bench, snoring softly. I envied her unconsciousness, her temporary escape from reality. Sleep would not come for me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Not the children I had killed, though they haunted me too, but the faces of their families. The parents, grandparents, siblings who would wake up this morning to discover that their loved ones had not died from illness or accident, but from murder. Mrs. Santos would be making coffee in her kitchen in Portland, the same ritual she had performed every morning since Maria died 15 years ago. But today, a police officer would knock on her door and shatter whatever peace she had managed to build from the fragments of her grief. The Williams family would be gathered around their breakfast table, perhaps sharing memories of Jennifer on what would have been her 21st birthday next month. Instead, they would learn that their baby girl had been murdered by someone they had trusted to protect her. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to block out the images, but they only became more vivid in the darkness. The guilt I had carried for 15 years felt like a living thing now, growing larger and more suffocating with each passing hour. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the cell. A guard appeared, keys jangling from his belt. "Thompson," he called. "Your lawyer is here." I stood up, surprised. I had not called anyone, had not even been offered my phone call yet. The drunk driver stirred on her bench, but did not wake up as I followed the guard down a hallway lined with identical cells. The interview room was similar to the conference room at the hotel, but smaller and more sterile. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the gray walls, and a metal table sat in the center of the room, flanked by 2 plastic chairs. A woman in an expensive suit was already seated, reviewing documents from a leather briefcase. She looked up when I entered, and I recognized her immediately from the society pages of the Seattle Times. Catherine Morrison, one of the city's most prominent defense attorneys. She was known for taking on high-profile cases and winning them through meticulous preparation and aggressive courtroom tactics. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I am Catherine Morrison. Your husband retained my services. Marcus. Even now, even after learning the truth about who I really was, he was trying to protect me." The realization brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Please, sit down," Catherine said, her voice professional but not unsympathetic. "We have a great deal to discuss, and not much time to do it." I took the chair across from her, my dress rustling against the plastic. In this harsh institutional lighting, the navy blue fabric looked almost black, I understand you spoke to the police last night without representation present, Catherine continued, consulting her notes. That was inadvisable. I confessed. I said simply, "There is not much you can do to help me now." Catherine set down her pen and studied my face with the same intensity Detective Chen had shown at the hotel. "Mrs. Thompson, I have been practicing criminal law for 23 years. I have represented everyone from white-collar embezzlers to serial killers. What I have learned in that time is that the story is never as simple as it first appears." "This one is," I replied. "I killed 7 children. I confess to it. I am guilty." "Guilt and legal culpability are not always the same thing," she said. "Tell me about your mental state during the period when these incidents occurred." Mental state. It was the same question Detective Chen had asked, framed differently, but seeking the same answer. What had driven me to become a killer of children? "I was grieving," I said. "My brother had died 6 months before I started working at the hospital. He was only 5 years old when he got sick, and I watched him suffer for 2 years before the cancer finally took him." Catherine made notes as I spoke, her pen moving quickly across the legal pad. "Had you sought any counseling or psychiatric help for this grief?" "No. I could not afford it, and I thought I was handling it well. I threw myself into work, picked up extra shifts, stayed busy. I thought if I helped enough sick children get better, it would somehow make up for not being able to save Jamie. But that is not what happened. No. Instead, every time I saw a child suffering, I saw my brother, and I started to believe that death was kinder than prolonged illness, that I was being merciful by ending their pain before it could get worse." Catherine nodded, still writing. "Were you sleeping during this period? Eating regularly? Maintaining normal social relationships?" I thought back to those dark months in Portland, the cramped studio apartment where I lived alone, the meals I skipped because I had no appetite, the nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of Jamie's illness. "No," I admitted. "I was barely functioning. I was working 12-hour shifts and then going home to an empty apartment. I had no friends, no family. The only human contact I had was at the hospital. And yet you continued to work with critically ill children. It was all I knew how to do. I had been studying nursing since I was 18, focused specifically on pediatric care. After Jamie died, it felt like the only way to honor his memory." Catherine set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Thompson, what you are describing sounds like a severe depressive episode, possibly complicated by post-traumatic stress disorder and complicated grief, none of which excuses what you did, but all of which could be relevant to your defense." "I do not want a defense," I said firmly. "I want to plead guilty and accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. Even if that punishment is life in prison without the possibility of parole?" The question hung in the air between us. Life in prison. It sounded abstract, impossible. But it was not impossible. It was the likely outcome for someone who had murdered 7 children. "Those families have been waiting 15 years for justice," I said. "They deserve to have this resolved quickly, without a long trial that forces them to relive their worst memories." Catherine studied me for a long moment. "That is admirable, Mrs. Thompson. But it is also my job to ensure that you receive competent legal representation, even if you do not want it." A knock at the door interrupted us. The guard entered with a cup of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in plastic. "Breakfast," he said gruffly, setting them on the table in front of me. The coffee was weak and bitter, but it was warm, and I realized I had not eaten or drunk anything since the canapés at the gala. The sandwich was peanut butter and jelly on white bread, the kind of simple meal I had not eaten since childhood. It tasted like innocence, like a time before I knew that good people could do terrible things. "There is something else we need to discuss," Catherine said after the guard left. "The media attention this case is going to generate." I had not thought about that. In my mind, this was a private matter between me, the victims' families, and the justice system. But Catherine was right. The arrest of a prominent socialite for a series of child murders 15 years ago would be front-page news in Seattle, and probably beyond. "Your husband is a public figure," Catherine continued. "The hospital board, the charity work, the social connections. This story has all the elements that journalists love: wealth, privilege, hidden secrets, dead children." "Marcus," I said suddenly. How is he handling this?" Catherine's expression softened slightly. "He is devastated, as you might expect, but he is also standing by you, at least for now. Hiring me was not cheap, and he paid my retainer without hesitation. After everything I had put him through, after destroying his reputation and possibly his career, Marcus was still trying to take care of me. The knowledge was both comforting and heartbreaking. "What happens next?" I asked. "You will be arraigned this afternoon. The prosecutor will read the charges and you will enter your plea. If you insist on pleading guilty, the judge will likely order a psychiatric evaluation to ensure you are competent to make that decision. And then, sentencing. Given the nature and number of the crimes, you are looking at multiple life sentences. The prosecutor might be willing to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for your cooperation and a guilty plea, but that is not guaranteed. The death penalty. I had not considered that possibility, but it made sense. Washington State had not executed anyone in years, but child murder was exactly the kind of crime that could change that. I would deserve it, I said quietly. Catherine reached across the table and touched my hand. It was the first gentle human contact I had experienced since Marcus had held my hand at the gala. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand that you feel guilty about what you did. You should feel guilty. But my job is not to judge you or to facilitate your self-destruction. My job is to ensure that you receive fair treatment under the law." "Fair treatment," I repeated. "What would be fair treatment for someone who murdered 7 children? That is for a judge and jury to decide, not for you." Before I could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Detective Chen, accompanied by a man in a suit I did not recognize. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Chen said, "this is District Attorney Michael Harrison. He would like to speak with you." D.A. Harrison was younger than I had expected, probably in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense eyes that suggested he took his job very seriously. He sat down across from me while Detective Chen remained standing by the door. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison began, "I have reviewed your confession from last night, and I want to give you an opportunity to cooperate fully with our investigation." Catherine immediately interjected. "My client has already confessed to the crimes. What more cooperation are you seeking?" Harrison opened a file folder and spread several photographs across the table. Crime scene photos, autopsy reports, hospital records, the bureaucratic documentation of 7 young lives cut short. "We have evidence linking Mrs. Thompson to 7 deaths, Harrison said. "But our investigation has uncovered some additional suspicious deaths that occurred during her tenure at Providence Medical Center. We believe there may have been more victims. More victims." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the photographs spread across the table, but they seemed to blur together into a collage of death and suffering. "How many more?" I whispered. "Potentially 3 additional children," Harrison replied. "All died during your shifts. All showed similar patterns of unexplained cardiac arrest. 3 more. That would bring the total to 10. 10 children whose lives I had ended. 10 families destroyed by my actions." Catherine was speaking. Something about not discussing additional charges without more preparation. But her voice seemed to come from very far away. I was remembering other nights. Other children whose faces had faded from my memory over the years. "There was Sarah Kim," I said suddenly, interrupting Catherine. "She was 6 years old, admitted for a routine tonsillectomy. She died of cardiac arrest 3 days after her surgery." Harrison made a note. "What about Benjamin Foster?" Benjamin. Emma Foster's older brother. I had killed both of them, I realized with horror. 2 children from the same family, and their parents had never known that their deaths were connected. "Yes," I said, my voice barely audible. "And Lisa Martinez. She was 4 years old." "Jesus Christ," Catherine muttered under her breath. 10 children. 10 innocent lives snuffed out by someone they should have been able to trust. The number felt impossibly large, too terrible to be real. But it was real, and I was responsible for all of it. "Why are you telling us this now?" Harrison asked. "Why not mention these victims in your original confession?" "I had tried to forget them," I admitted. After 15 years, some of the memories had faded. But seeing the photographs, hearing their names, it all came back. Harrison gathered up the photos and returned them to his file. "Mrs. Thompson, in light of these additional admissions, I am prepared to offer you a deal." "What kind of deal?" Catherine asked, though I could hear the skepticism in her voice. Life in prison without the possibility of parole, in exchange for a detailed confession to all 10 murders, and your cooperation in providing closure to the families. Life without parole. It meant I would die in prison, probably decades from now. Alone and forgotten except by those whose lives I had destroyed. It was a harsh sentence, but not as harsh as I deserved. What is the alternative? Catherine asked. Trial, with the possibility of the death penalty, Harrison replied bluntly. Given the number of victims and the defendant's position of trust, I believe a jury would be very receptive to capital punishment, the death penalty versus life in prison. 2 different forms of the same ultimate punishment. I thought about Marcus, about the life we had built together, about all the dreams and plans that would never come to fruition now. But mostly I thought about 10 children who would never grow up, never fall in love, never have children of their own. They had been robbed of everything, and I was the thief who had taken it from them. I will take the deal, I said. Catherine started to object, but I held up my hand to stop her. I will take the deal, and I will cooperate fully with your investigation. Those families deserve to know the truth about what happened to their children. Harrison nodded grimly. The formal plea hearing will be scheduled for next week. Until then, you will remain in custody. As he gathered his papers and prepared to leave, I asked the question that had been haunting me since my arrest. The families, I said. Have they been notified? Some of them, Detective Chen replied. We started making calls this morning. It is difficult news to deliver. I could only imagine. 15 years after burying their children, these families were learning that their grief had been based on a lie. Their children had not died from illness or medical complications. They had been murdered by someone who was supposed to protect them. I want to write letters, I said suddenly, to each family. I want to apologize and try to explain what happened. Harrison and Detective Chen exchanged glances. That might not be advisable from a legal standpoint, Harrison said carefully. I do not care about the legal standpoint, I replied. I care about those families. They have suffered enough because of me. Catherine looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her that it would be futile. We will discuss it, she said finally. After the prosecutor and detective left, Catherine and I sat in silence for several minutes. The harsh fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, and I could hear the sounds of the city waking up outside the building. Seattle was going about its morning routine, unaware that one of its most respected citizens had just confessed to being a serial killer. Mrs. Thompson, Catherine said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. I nodded. Do you want to die? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? I mean, are you accepting this plea deal because you believe it is just, or because you have given up on life and want to punish yourself? I considered the question carefully. Did I want to die? The thought had certainly occurred to me over the years, especially in the darkest moments when the guilt became almost unbearable. But I had never acted on those thoughts, partly because of Marcus, and partly because I believed that living with the knowledge of what I had done was a more appropriate punishment than the escape that death would provide. I want to face the consequences of my actions, I said finally. I want those families to have closure, and I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could kill children. Catherine nodded slowly. All right, but I want you to understand that accepting this plea deal means giving up any chance of ever being free again. You will die in prison, probably alone, possibly decades from now when everyone who remembers this case is dead themselves. I understand. And I want you to understand that there are defenses we could pursue. Diminished capacity, mental illness, extreme emotional disturbance. You were clearly not in your right mind when these crimes occurred. But I still committed them, I said. Those children are still dead because of my actions. No amount of psychological explanation can change that. Catherine closed her briefcase and stood up. I will work with the prosecutor to finalize the plea agreement. The arraignment is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon. As she prepared to leave, I asked one more question. Have you spoken to Marcus? How is he handling all of this? Catherine paused at the door. He is devastated, as you might expect. His reputation is in ruins. His career is probably over, and his marriage is certainly finished. But he still loves the woman he thought he married, and that is why he hired me to represent you. After she left, I was escorted back to the holding cell. My cellmate was awake now, nursing a hangover and complaining loudly about the coffee. I lay down on the narrow bench and stared at the ceiling. trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. This time yesterday, I had been Elena Whitmore, respected member of Seattle society, devoted wife to one of the city's most prominent citizens. I had been getting ready for the charity gala, choosing between 2 different pairs of earrings, worrying about whether my dress was appropriate for the occasion. Now I was Rebecca Thompson again, confessed child killer, facing the rest of my life in prison. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which I might eventually wake up. But I would not wake up from this. This was my reality now, the inevitable conclusion to a deception that had lasted 15 years. I had always known, deep down, that this day would come. You cannot kill 10 children and expect to escape justice forever. The arraignment was a blur of legal formalities and media attention. The courthouse was surrounded by reporters and protesters, some calling for my execution, others simply trying to understand how someone like me could have hidden among them for so long. I stood before Judge Patricia Williams, a coincidence of names that felt like cosmic justice, and entered my plea. "Guilty, Your Honor." The words echoed through the courtroom, final and irrevocable. There was no taking them back, no changing my mind, no hoping for a different outcome. I was guilty. I had admitted my guilt, and now I would face the consequences. The judge ordered a pre-sentencing report and scheduled the sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later. As I was led away in handcuffs, I caught sight of Marcus in the gallery. He looked older than his 53 years, his face drawn and pale, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. Our eyes met for just a moment before the bailiff guided me toward the door. In that brief glance, I saw everything I was losing. Love, companionship, the life we had built together, the future we had planned. All of it was gone now, sacrificed on the altar of truth and justice. But I also saw something else in his eyes. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least understanding. He knew now why I had been so distant sometimes, why I woke up screaming from nightmares I could never explain, why I threw myself so completely into charity work with sick children. He knew, and somehow, impossibly, he did not hate me for it. The van that transported me back to the jail was surrounded by news crews. Through the tinted windows, I could see reporters shouting questions and photographers snapping pictures. By tonight, my face would be on every television screen in the country, and tomorrow it would be on the front page of every newspaper. The story would be told and retold, analyzed and dissected, turned into documentaries and made for television movies. But none of those accounts would capture the real truth of what had happened, because the real truth was too complex and too painful for easy consumption. The real truth was that good people could do terrible things, that grief and mental illness could transform a healer into a killer, that the line between mercy and murder was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And the real truth was that 10 children were dead, and no amount of explanation or justification could bring them back. As the jail door closed behind me, I thought about the letters I wanted to write to the families. Words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what I had done, but they were all I had to offer. Apologies could not resurrect the dead, but they might provide some small measure of closure to those who had suffered because of my actions. I would spend the rest of my life in prison, but perhaps that time could be used for something more than just punishment. Perhaps I could help researchers understand how someone like me could become a killer, so that future tragedies might be prevented. It was a small hope, but it was the only one I had left. The cell door locked behind me with a metallic clang that sounded like finality itself. Rebecca Thompson was back, and this time there would be no escape.